The afternoon sun was blazing hot, beating down on the asphalt streets outside the old community center. Inside, the air was thick and smelled faintly of floor wax and old gym socks. It was Tuesday, which meant music class, and usually Mr. Baker dreaded Tuesdays. He sat on a wobbly chair behind a metal desk, rubbing his temples. The room was chaotic. Kids were running around, banging on plastic buckets, shouting over the noise of a passing police siren outside the window. It was the kind of place where kids were dropped off just so their parents could have a few hours of peace. Or where the city sent children who had nowhere else to go. Mr. Baker meant well. But after 20 years of teaching in underfunded schools, his patience was wearing thin. He was just about to blow his whistle and demand order when the heavy door creaked open. A woman in a gray suit walked in, looking exhausted. She was holding a clipboard and didn't even smile at Mr. Baker. Behind her stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. She was tiny, wearing a hoodie that looked 2 sizes too big and jeans that were frayed at the bottom. Her head was down, her long dark hair falling over her face, hiding her eyes. "Mr. Baker?" The woman in the suit asked, though she walked right up to his desk as if she already knew who he was. "I'm Miss Clark from Social Services. This is Chloe." Mr. Baker stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "Okay, we weren't expecting a new student today." "It was a last-minute placement," Miss Clark said, checking her watch. She clearly had somewhere else to be. Chloe has been in the system for a while. This is her 3rd home this year. She doesn't like to talk. Honestly, she doesn't like much of anything. She looked down at the little girl, who hadn't moved a muscle. "Don't expect her to participate. Just keep her safe and out of trouble until 4 o'clock. Mr. Baker looked at Chloe. She stood perfectly still, like a statue. The noise of the room didn't seem to bother her, but she also didn't seem to be part of it. "All right," he sighed. "I can do that. Go have a seat, Chloe." Miss Clark gave a quick nod and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. The room went back to its normal level of noise, but the energy felt different. Now, there was a stranger among them. Chloe didn't move. She stood near the door for a moment, clutching the straps of her worn-out backpack. Mr. Baker pointed to a circle of plastic chairs in the middle of the room. "Go sit over there, Chloe. We're starting in 5 minutes." Slowly, very slowly, she walked across the room. She moved like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. The other kids watched her with curiosity. They knew a foster kid when they saw one. There were whispers and a few giggles, but Chloe ignored them. She walked past the drums, past the box of tambourines, and past the shiny guitars leaning against the wall. She didn't look at any of them. Instead, she walked to the far corner of the room, away from the windows and the other children. In that corner, pushed up against the wall, covered in peeling paint, sat an old upright piano. It was a monster of a thing, dark wood chipped at the corners, and its legs were scuffed. It was out of tune, and most of the students used it as a shelf for their water bottles or backpacks. Chloe sat on the scratched wooden bench. She didn't take off her backpack. She just sat there, staring at the fallboard that covered the keys. Mr. Baker blew his whistle sharply. "Okay, settle down. Everyone in the circle, now." The kids groaned but shuffled toward the chairs. Mr. Baker pulled out his guitar and began tuning it, wincing at the sound. He glanced over at the corner. Usually the new kids would try to make friends, or they would act out to get attention. But Chloe just sat there. She was staring at the piano with a look that Mr. Baker couldn't quite read. It wasn't boredom. It was something else. It looked like hunger. "All right, who remembers the C scale we learned last week?" Mr. Baker asked the group. A few hands went up. Most of the kids were looking at their phones or picking at the carpet. Mr. Baker tried to engage them, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt bad for the new girl, Chloe. He knew what the social worker meant. He had seen kids like her before, kids who moved around so much they stopped trying to make connections. They built walls to keep from getting hurt. He assumed she would just sit there, daydreaming, waiting for the clock to hit 4 so she could leave. He strummed a chord on his guitar, slightly off-key. "Come on, guys, focus. We have the showcase in 2 months. We don't want to look bad up there." From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He turned his head. Chloe had leaned forward. She reached out a small, pale hand and rested it on the side of the piano. She wasn't touching the keys yet, just tracing the dust on the wood with her finger. She was tracing the letters that spelled out the brand of the piano, which were mostly worn away. It was strange. The room was loud, chaotic, and full of energy, but the corner where Chloe sat felt like a vacuum. She was isolated, completely alone in her own world. Mr. Baker watched her for a moment, feeling a pang of pity. He remembered how hard it was to be a kid, to feel like you didn't belong. He made a mental note to try to talk to her later, maybe offer her a snack or a book. He didn't think she had any musical talent. She looked like a child who had been forgotten by the world. Okay. Break time, Mr. Baker announced 5 minutes later, realizing he was fighting a losing battle. Against their attention spans, the kids jumped up and ran for the water fountain or their snacks. The room erupted into noise again. Mr. Baker set his guitar down and took a sip of his lukewarm coffee. He looked over to check on the quiet girl in the corner. He expected her to be curled up, maybe sleeping, but she wasn't. Single quotes. Chloe had scooted closer to the piano. Her backpack was on the floor now. She was sitting on the edge of the bench, her body rigid. Her hands were hovering over the closed keyboard, just an inch above the wood. She was moving her fingers silently, pressing down on nothing, like she was playing a song only she could hear. Mr. Baker squinted, confused. Her hands weren't moving randomly. They had a pattern. Her left hand moved in a steady rhythm, and her right hand played invisible melody lines. She wasn't just daydreaming. She was practicing, but how? If she had been in the system her whole life, moving from house to house, when did she have time for lessons? He stood up, intending to walk over and tell her to open the piano if she wanted to play, or to leave it alone if she was just going to pretend. But before he could take a step, the heavy door opened again. A large, burly man walked in. It was the maintenance worker looking to fix the AC unit. "Hey, Mr. Baker," the man shouted, his voice booming and echoing off the walls. "It's boiling in here." The loud noise made Chloe jump. She snatched her hands back as if she had been burned. She slid back on the bench, pulled her hood up over her head, and grabbed her backpack, shrinking into herself instantly. The connection was broken. The mysterious focus in her eyes vanished, replaced by the same dull, empty look she had when she walked in. Mr. Baker paused, watching her. He shook his head, telling himself he was imagining things. She was just a bored kid mimicking what she thought people did at pianos. He turned back to the maintenance man. "Yeah, I know, it's bad. The thermostat is broken." As the men talked, Chloe sat in the corner, silent and invisible once again. No one in the room expected anything from her. To them, she was just another quiet problem to manage. But the piano sat there, silent and heavy, holding a secret that none of them suspected yet. She hadn't made a sound, but in her mind the music was already playing. 2 weeks drifted by, and nothing much changed in the music room. The weather turned from hot to humid, making the air inside feel heavy and sticky. Mr. Baker was still tired, and the kids were still loud. But Chloe remained a mystery. She never spoke a single word, not even to say good morning or thank you. She did her work, if you could call it that, mostly just drawing on scraps of paper or staring at the clock. The other students had mostly stopped paying attention to her. In a school full of noise, silence was easy to ignore. Mr. Baker tried, he really did. He tried to ask her what kind of music she liked, or if she wanted to try the triangle, but she would just look at him with those big, dark eyes and look away. He eventually stopped pushing, deciding to just let her be. He figured she had enough people pushing her around in her life. She didn't need it from him, too. Then came a Tuesday that felt different from the start. The air pressure had dropped, and a big summer storm was brewing outside. The sky was turning a bruised purple color. The kids could feel the energy in the air. They were antsier than usual. They were banging on the desks, running in circles, and shouting over the rumble of thunder in the distance. Mr. Baker had a headache that felt like a tight band around his forehead. Around 2 o'clock. Just as the class was supposed to start a rhythm exercise, the classroom phone rang. It was a shrill, piercing sound that made everyone wince. Mr. Baker picked it up, expecting the principal. Instead, it was the hospital. His elderly mother had fallen again. His face went pale. I have to go, he told the class abruptly, his voice shaking slightly. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Do not leave the room. Do not break anything. He looked around the room frantically. Peter, you're in charge. He pointed to a tall boy who was usually quiet. Okay. Mr. Baker, Peter said, but he didn't look like he cared much. Mr. Baker grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door. Leaving it slightly ajar, the moment the heavy door clicked shut, the atmosphere shifted. It was like a pot boiling over. The rules had left the room with the teacher. Peter didn't try to control anyone. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started playing a game. The other kids saw this as a green light to do whatever they wanted. Two boys started a wrestling match near the whiteboard. A group of girls began screaming with laughter about something on a phone screen. Someone found a bag of marbles and spilled them on the floor, where they rolled everywhere with a loud clatter. The room became a storm of noise, matching the weather outside. Chloe sat in her usual spot, the plastic chair scraping against the floor as the wrestling match bumped into her table. She didn't react. She just stood up and stepped away from the chaos. She moved to the side of the room, her eyes fixed on the corner. The old upright piano sat there, covered in a fine layer of gray dust. It looked sad and forgotten. The fall board, the cover that goes over the keys, was down, making it look like a smooth wooden desk. But Chloe knew what was underneath. She had been thinking about it for 14 days. She had been dreaming about the keys at night. She looked at the door. Mr. Baker was gone. The other kids were too busy to notice her. Even Peter had headphones on now. This was her chance. She walked toward the piano. Her sneakers didn't make a sound on the carpet. She felt her heart beating faster, a thump, thump, thump against her ribs that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a deep, aching need. She reached the instrument and stopped. It was tall. From down here, looking up at the music rack, it seemed like a giant tower. She reached out and her hand touched the cool wood. It felt familiar, almost like shaking hands with an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She ran her fingers along the side, feeling the scratches and the dents. This piano had lived a hard life, just like her. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the latch on the fallboard. It was stiff. She had to use both hands to push it. Click. The sound was tiny, but to Chloe it sounded like a gunshot. She froze, her eyes darting to the class. No one looked. The wrestling match was getting louder. The girls were singing along to a pop song now. She took a deep breath and pushed the cover down. It slid with a soft swoosh. There they were. The keys, they were yellowed with age, some of them chipped, and they looked a little crooked. They weren't the shiny, perfect white keys she saw in pictures. But to her, they were beautiful. She sat down on the bench. It creaked under her weight. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment. She closed her eyes and listened. In her head, she could hear a song. It was a song she used to hear a long time ago, before the foster homes, before the silence. It was a memory of a voice singing, and of hands playing these exact notes. She opened her eyes and hovered her hands over the keys. Her fingers were small, but they looked strong. She didn't know the names of the notes. She didn't know what a C major chord was, but her hands knew what to do. It was like they had a memory of their own. She pressed down. A single note rang out. A deep, low E. It wasn't perfectly in tune. It had a slight wobble to it, but the sound was rich and full. It cut through the noise of the room like a knife. The wrestling match paused for a split second. One of the girls looked up from her phone. What was that? She asked. Chloe didn't stop. She pressed another key, then a third. A chord. It was sad and dark, matching the sky outside. She began to play. It wasn't Chopsticks or Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It was a slow, heavy melody. Her left hand played a steady, marching rhythm, low on the bass keys. Thump, thump, thump. Her right hand moved higher, weaving a melody that sounded like rain falling on a roof. She wasn't just hitting notes. She was pressing into them, leaning her whole body into the sound. Her face, usually so blank and empty, changed. Her eyebrows furrowed. She bit her lip. She was feeling the music, letting all the frustration and loneliness of the past 2 weeks pour out of her fingers and into the strings. The room started to get quiet. It wasn't an immediate silence. It happened slowly, like a wave washing over the shore. First the wrestlers stopped. They stood up, breathing hard, and looked toward the corner. Then, the girls with the phone lowered the volume. Peter took off his headphones. They all looked at Chloe. They had never heard anything like this come out of that old, broken piano. It sounded like a completely different instrument. The vibrations shook the floorboards. The dust motes dancing in the light seemed to move to the rhythm of her hands. Chloe didn't know they were watching. She was lost in the sound. She played a section that was fast and angry, her fingers flying up and down the keys, making the piano rattle. Then she slowed down, playing soft, gentle notes that sounded like a whisper. For the first time since she walked into the school, Chloe wasn't the foster kid or the quiet girl. She was a conductor. She was powerful. The other kids didn't see her messy hair or her worn-out clothes anymore. They just saw the girl making the magic. The wind outside howled, rattling the window pane, and inside the music rose to meet it. It was a sound of sadness, but also of hope. It was the sound of a soul finally waking up. She hit a final, low chord with both hands and held it, letting the vibration hum in the air until it faded into nothingness. She sat there, her hands still resting on the keys, her chest heaving. The room was dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if they were all afraid that if they made a sound, the spell would break. And then the doorknob turned, the heavy door swung open, and Mr. Baker rushed back in, looking worried and out of breath. "Okay, I'm back," he said loudly, his voice shattering the quiet. "I hope everyone behaved." He stopped. He looked at the class. They were all standing frozen, looking at the back corner. He turned his head to see what they were looking at. Chloe was sitting at the piano. But the moment she heard his voice, she yanked her hands back. She slammed the fallboard shut with a loud bang and jumped off the bench, grabbing her backpack. She scurried back to her chair in the corner, pulling her hood up and hiding her face. Mr. Baker looked at the piano, then at the kids, then at Chloe. He felt confused. He looked at Peter. "What happened? Did someone break something?" Peter shook his head slowly. He looked at Mr. Baker with eyes wide open. "No, sir," Peter whispered. You missed it." Mr. Baker frowned. He looked at Chloe, who was staring intently at her sneakers, pretending to be invisible again. The room felt strange, like the air was charged with electricity. He knew something had changed, but he couldn't figure out what. He walked to his desk and sat down, unaware that in the 10 minutes he was gone, the world had shifted on its axis. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. The kids packed up slowly, throwing glances at the piano and then at the quiet girl in the hoodie. They walked out in a daze. The usual noise didn't return. They were all thinking about the sound they had heard. Chloe waited until everyone else had left. She walked to the door, but she paused. She looked back at the piano one last time. The dust was settling on the keys again. She gave the slightest nod, just a tiny tilt of her head, and then she walked out into the hallway, taking her secret with her. But the secret wasn't hers alone anymore. The walls had heard it, and so had the students. They didn't expect much from her. But that was about to change. The days that followed that strange afternoon were different for Mr. Baker. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something huge. The kids in his class were acting weird, too. Usually they would be bouncing off the walls by the time Friday rolled up, but this week there was a lot of whispering. Every time he turned around, he saw them looking toward the back corner where Chloe sat. It was particularly annoying because he didn't know what they were whispering about. He felt like the only person who hadn't gotten the joke. On Thursday, Mr. Baker decided he needed to get to the bottom of it. He kept the class a few minutes late, not because he had extra work, but because he wanted to talk to Peter, the tall boy who had been watching the door that day. "All right. Everyone else get going," Mr. Baker said, shooing the other kids toward the door. Peter, hang back for a second. Help me put these stands away. Peter sighed but nodded. When the room was clear, Mr. Baker leaned against the piano, crossing his arms. Okay, Peter, give it to me straight. What happened on Tuesday when I stepped out? Why is everyone looking at Chloe? Peter looked down at his sneakers, kicking at the carpet. He looked a little guilty, like he was betraying a secret. It wasn't us, Mr. Baker. It was her. Chloe? Mr. Baker laughed skeptically. Peter, the girl hasn't said 3 words since she got here. She barely moves. I know, Peter said, his eyes getting wide. But she touched the piano. And Mr. Baker... She played it. Mr. Baker frowned. Played it? Like banged on it? Like a toddler? No, Peter shook his head quickly. No, she played it for real. Like really, really. It sounded like a movie. Like something you hear in a church. It was scary good. Peter looked over at the instrument. I don't know how, but she's a genius or something. Mr. Baker looked at the dusty piano. He looked back at Peter. He wanted to believe the kid was just pulling his leg. But Peter was serious. Mr. Baker had been teaching long enough to know when a student was lying to get out of trouble. And this wasn't that. Okay, Mr. Baker said slowly. Thanks, Peter, you can go. Peter grabbed his bag and left, leaving Mr. Baker alone in the quiet room. Mr. Baker walked over to the piano. He lifted the fallboard and stared at the keys. They looked the same as they always did, dirty, a little yellow, chipped ivory. He sat down on the bench and played a simple C major chord. It sounded dull and clunky, just like it always did. He shook his head. Asterisk a genius? In this neighborhood? With a foster kid who has no record of lessons? It didn't make sense, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He remembered the way Chloe looked at the instrument. Not like a piece of furniture, but like something she was hungry for. Friday afternoon arrived with a heavy rain that turned the windows into blurry gray mirrors. The class was restless because of the storm. Mr. Baker decided to set a trap. It wasn't a mean trap. It was a trap of opportunity. Okay, everyone, he announced, standing up. I left some important papers in the main office. I need to go get them. I will be gone for exactly 10 minutes. He looked at the clock on the wall. I expect you to stay in your seats and read or talk quietly. Peter, you're in charge again. Yes, sir, Peter said, giving Mr. Baker a knowing look. Peter knew what was up. Mr. Baker walked out into the hallway and closed the door. But he didn't go to the office. Instead, he walked a few feet away and stood right next to the door, pressing his back against the cold wall. He held his breath. He felt a little silly, like a spy in a cartoon, but he had to know. Inside the room, he could hear the shuffling of chairs. He heard someone giggle. Then he heard the noise level drop. It was that specific hush that falls when people are waiting for something to happen. He waited 1 minute. 2 minutes. Nothing. He was just about to give up and go back in, thinking Peter had been messing with him, when a sound drifted through the door that wasn't a bang. It was a single clear note. A high, piercing note that rang out like a bell. Mr. Baker froze. Then came another note. And then a cascade of them. It was fast, too fast for a beginner. He recognized the song instantly, though he couldn't believe his ears. It was Clair de Lune. It was a piece by a composer named Debussy, a piece that was famous for being beautiful but incredibly difficult. It required hands that could move independently, a delicate touch, and a deep understanding of emotion. Mr. Baker slowly turned his head and peeked through the small, round glass window in the center of the door. The classroom was silent. Every single student was turned around in their seats, looking at the corner. Peter was standing up, his mouth slightly open, and there was Chloe. She wasn't the hunched-over, scared little girl Mr. Baker was used to seeing. She was sitting tall. Her back was straight, her posture perfect. Her hood had fallen back, revealing her face. She wasn't looking at the keys. She was looking through them, her eyes closed, as if she was seeing the music in the air. Her hands were dancing. Mr. Baker had seen concert pianists on television, and this looked just like that. Her left hand was playing the deep, rolling bass notes, creating a wave of sound, while her right hand played the shimmering melody on top. The old piano, which usually sounded like a box of rocks, was singing. The girl was somehow pulling the sound out of it, coaxing the wooden strings to vibrate with a richness that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't just the notes, either. It was the way she played them. She wasn't hitting the keys. She was caressing them. She slowed down at the sad parts and sped up at the exciting parts. It was natural. It was INSTINCTUL. Mr. Baker felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold hallway. He realized with a shock that Peter was right. This wasn't just talent. This was a gift, but how? He knew her file. She had bounced between terrible schools and group homes. She had never had a piano lesson in her life. She probably didn't even know how to read music. Yet here she was, playing a masterpiece. He watched her fingers closely. He saw that her technique wasn't perfect sometimes. She flattened her fingers a little too much, but she compensated with speed and feeling. It was raw, unpolished genius. It was like watching a street kid who had never played. Basketball suddenly sank a half-court shot blindfolded. The music swelled, filling the classroom and spilling out into the hallway. The sadness of the song seemed to wrap around Chloe like a blanket. Mr. Baker realized that for her, this wasn't just a song. It was a way to let out all the things she couldn't say. The anger at her parents, the fear of the foster system, the loneliness of being the new kid everywhere she went, it was all pouring out of her fingertips. The piece came to an end. She played the final chords softly, letting them fade into silence. Just like she had done on Tuesday. The room stayed quiet for a long time. No one clapped. No one moved. It felt wrong to break the spell. Chloe sat there for a moment, her hands hovering over the keys, her eyes still closed. She looked peaceful, something Mr. Baker had never seen on her face before. Then her shoulders slumped. The moment passed. The reality of the world came back. She pulled her hands back, her face hardened again, and she reached to close the piano cover. That was Mr. Baker's cue. He took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and walked in. The heavy sound of the door made everyone jump. Chloe froze. She yanked her hands away from the piano as if she had been burned. She grabbed her backpack and tried to shrink into the corner, her face flushing red with embarrassment. She looked terrified, like she expected to be yelled at for playing. Mr. Baker didn't yell. He didn't even speak to the class. He walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes fixed on her. The other kids moved out of his way, parting like the Red Sea. He stopped in front of the piano. He looked at the keys, still vibrating slightly from her touch. And then he looked at Chloe. She was shaking, looking at the floor, waiting for the punishment. "Chloe," Mr. Baker said softly. His voice sounded different than usual, gentler, full of respect. She didn't look up. Mr. Baker crouched down so he was eye level with her. "How long?" he asked. She didn't say anything. She just shrugged a tiny, almost invisible shrug. "Have you ever had a lesson?" he asked. "A teacher?" She finally looked up. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. She shook her head no. Just once. A sharp, definite movement. Mr. Baker stood up. He looked at the class, then back at the girl. He felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. He had spent weeks feeling sorry for this girl, thinking she was a lost cause with no future. He thought she was just another kid who would fall through the cracks of the system. He realized now that he was the one who was blind. She wasn't a problem to be managed. She was a powerhouse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a lint-covered peppermint. He held it out to her. "You don't have to hide it anymore," Mr. Baker said. "Not in here." Chloe looked at the candy, then at his face. She saw that he wasn't mad. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and took it. She didn't eat it. She just held it tight in her fist. "Class is dismissed," Mr. Baker announced, his eyes still on Chloe. "Everyone except Chloe." The kids groaned, but they scrambled to get their bags. As they filed out, Peter stopped at the door. He looked at Mr. Baker and gave him a thumbs up. Mr. Baker nodded back. When the door clicked shut and they were alone, Mr. Baker pulled up a chair and sat next to the bench. He didn't say anything for a while. He just let the silence sit there. He knew that if he pushed her too hard, she would retreat again. So, he said finally. The big night arrived faster than anyone expected. The old gymnasium, which usually smelled like sweaty socks and old bleach, had been transformed for the annual community showcase. Volunteers had set up rows of folding chairs that squeaked every time someone moved, and the harsh overhead lights were replaced by a few spotlights that made the dust in the air look like glitter. Backstage, it was absolute chaos. Kids were running around in costumes that didn't fit right, parents were yelling over the noise to fix hair and ties, and the air smelled of hairspray and nervousness. But in the far corner of the backstage area, it was dead silent. Chloe sat on a plastic crate, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked pale, almost ghostly. Her hoodie was replaced by a simple white button-down shirt that Mr. Baker had bought for her, but she kept pulling at the collar like it was choking her. She was shaking. Not just a little tremble, but a full-body shake that she couldn't control. Mr. Baker knelt down in front of her, holding a bottle of water. "Hey," he said softly. "Drink a little bit." Chloe shook her head. She stared at the floor, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't do this. She wanted to run out the back door, into the dark, and keep running until she found a hole to crawl into. The idea of walking out there, under those lights, with all those eyes staring at her, was worse than the foster homes. It was worse than the loneliness. "I can't," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken in days. Her voice was raspy and small. "Mr. Baker, I can't." "Yes, you can," he said firmly but gently. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. He felt her tense up but then slowly relax. "Chloe, look at me." She lifted her eyes. "Those people out there?" Mr. Baker pointed toward the curtain where the muffled sounds of a bad violin solo were drifting through. "They don't know you. They think they know you. They see a foster kid. They see a statistic. But we know the truth." "I don't want them to look at me," she said, a tear spilling over her cheek. "They are going to look," Mr. Baker said. "But when you finish playing, they aren't going to see a foster kid anymore. They're going to see a musician. They're going to see a queen. You have the power to change how they see you, just by touching those keys." Chloe wiped her face with the sleeve of her shirt. She looked at the piano on stage. It was a shiny black grand piano on loan from the high school across town. It looked massive and terrifying compared to the old upright she practiced on. "Just play for yourself," Mr. Baker said, standing up and offering her a hand. "Forget the audience. Just tell your story." Chloe took a deep breath. She looked at his hand, then took it. She stood up. Her legs felt like jelly, but she stood. "Okay," she whispered. On the other side of the curtain, the previous act finished. There was polite, scattered applause. The principal walked onto the stage, his footsteps booming on the wooden planks. He tapped the microphone, causing a screech of feedback that made everyone flinch. "And now," the principal's voice boomed, "for our final performance of the evening, we have a very special surprise from Mr. Baker's class. Please welcome Chloe." The curtains parted. The walk to the piano felt like the longest journey of Chloe's life. The lights hit her face, blinding her. She couldn't see the audience clearly, just a sea of dark shapes. She could feel hundreds of eyes boring into her. She heard whispering. "Is that the new girl? Asterisk, asterisk, she looks tiny. Asterisk, asterisk, do you think she can even reach the pedals? Asterisk, they were judging her." She could feel it. They expected her to be cute, or maybe to fail. They expected a nursery rhyme. They expected nothing. Chloe sat down on the bench. It was leather and cold. She adjusted the height. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment. She closed her eyes. She blocked out the whispers. She blocked out the heat of the lights. She thought about the old dusty piano in the corner of the classroom. She thought about the silence she used to live in. She opened her eyes. She placed her hands on the keys. She didn't play a chord. She started with a single sharp note. Like a crack of thunder. Then her hands exploded into motion. She wasn't playing a simple children's song. She launched into a piece by a composer named Chopin, a piece known for being difficult and full of fire. It was fast. It was aggressive. It was angry. The audience gasped. The sound that came out of that piano wasn't the polite plinking of a beginner. It was a roar. Chloe's left hand was pounding out the rhythm, marching like an army, while her right hand flew up and down the keys in a blur of motion. She was attacking the piano, pouring every bit of her frustration, every night spent in a strange bed, every mean word she had ever heard. Into the music, the whispers in the crowd died instantly. You could feel the shockwave ripple through the room. People stopped looking at their phones. The lady in the front row dropped her purse. The principal stepped back, his mouth hanging open. Chloe didn't notice any of this. Her world had shrunk down to the black and white keys. She wasn't scared anymore. She was powerful. In real life, she was small and quiet. But here, on this bench, she was a giant. The music shifted. It went from the angry storm to a section that was incredibly beautiful and sad. Her touch became delicate feather light. The notes hung in the air, shimmering like stars. It was a sound so pure that it made people want to cry. It sounded like a heart-breaking dot. Mr. Baker stood in the wings, watching. He had tears in his eyes. He knew she was good, but seeing her like this transformed, commanding the stage, was something else entirely. She wasn't just playing notes. She was bleeding emotion. The piece built up again, faster and faster, climbing toward the climax. Chloe's body was swaying, her hair flying around her face. She was sweating, her face flushed red. She was hitting the keys so hard that the grand piano was actually shaking. She reached the final run, a cascade of notes rushing down the keyboard like a waterfall. She slammed her hands down on the final chords, 3 loud, deep notes that rang out through the gymnasium, vibrating through the floorboards and into the solace of everyone's shoes. Bam, bam, bam. She held the pose, her hands hovering over the keys, her chest heaving. There was absolute silence, not a cough, not a whisper, not a squeak from a chair. The silence stretched out for 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The dust motes danced in the spotlights. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, afraid that if they let it out, the magic would disappear. Then a man in the third row stood up. Then a woman in the front row stood up. Then, all at once, the room erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. People were shouting, "Bravo!" and "Wow!" It was a wall of sound that hit Chloe like a physical force. Chloe jumped. The spell broke. She looked out at the crowd, blinking against the lights. She saw people standing. She saw people crying. She saw Mr. Baker clapping so hard his hands must have been hurting. She realized they weren't looking at her with pity anymore. They were looking at her with awe. She stood up. She didn't bow like she had practiced. She just stood there, looking awkward and small again, but she couldn't stop a small, shy smile from touching her lips. She gave a quick, nervous wave and turned and ran off the stage. As soon as she hit the backstage darkness, Mr. Baker grabbed her in a hug. "You did it! You did it!" he shouted, laughing. Chloe was shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the adrenaline rushing through her veins. "I was loud," she whispered, surprised. "You were thunder," Mr. Baker said. Outside, the applause was still going on. They were clapping for an encore, calling her name. The girl nobody expected anything from had just brought the house down. She walked out of the gym with her head held high, leaving her silence behind her, step by step. The days following the showcase felt like a dream to Chloe, but not the scary kind she was used to. When she walked into the community center the next Monday, everything looked the same peeling paint, the same scuffed floors, but the way people treated her had changed completely. It was like she had been walking around in black and white, and suddenly someone turned on the color. The other kids didn't ignore her anymore. They didn't whisper behind her back. Instead, they wanted to sit near her. They wanted to know how she did it. A girl named Zoe, who used to make fun of Chloe's old shoes, came up to her at break time. "Hey," Zoe said, looking a little shy. "That was really cool on Friday. My mom was crying and she never cries." Chloe didn't know what to say. She just nodded and gave a small smile. She wasn't used to compliments. They felt strange, like wearing a coat that was too big. But she liked the feeling. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not because she blended in, but because she stood out. However, real life doesn't stay in the spotlight forever. The buzz of the performance eventually faded into the background of daily routine. The hard truth was that Chloe was still a foster kid. The system that moved her around like a piece of luggage didn't care much that she could play Chopin. 2 weeks later, the social worker, Miss Clark, came back to the center. She was holding a file folder and looking grave. Mr. Baker saw her from across the room and felt his stomach drop. He knew that look. It meant paperwork. It meant moving vans. Mr. Baker rushed over to intercept her before she could get to Chloe. "Miss Clark," he said, a little out of breath. "Is there a problem?" "There's a placement shift," Miss Clark said, flipping a page in her folder. "The current home is overcrowded. We have a spot open in a group home on the other side of the city. It's far from here, so she have to transfer programs." Mr. Baker felt a cold spike of panic. If Chloe moved to the other side of the city, she wouldn't have the piano. She wouldn't have him. She would be back in the noise and the music would die. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when they had just found her voice. "You can't do that," Mr. Baker said, surprising himself with his own boldness. Mrs. Clark looked over her glasses at him. "Mr. Baker, I have a job to do." "We don't have a choice." "You do have a choice," he said firmly. "Give me a week. I have an idea." Miss Clark sighed, checking her watch. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes. 1 week? But if you can't find a solution, the van comes next Tuesday." Mr. Baker spent the next 3 days on the phone. He called everyone he knew. He called his old college friends. He called the local news station, who had done a small story on the showcase. He called the high school superintendent. He was tired, he was grumpy, and his students thought he was going crazy because he kept canceling free time to make calls in the office. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, he got the call he was waiting for. It was the City Conservatory of Music. It was a fancy school for talented kids, usually for rich families. But they had just started a new scholarship fund for undiscovered youth. They had seen the video of Chloe. Mr. Baker hung up the phone and let out a shout that scared the class. "Chloe," he called out, "pack your things. We're going on a field trip." They took a bus ride to the rich part of the city where the buildings were made of glass and the lawns were perfectly green. Chloe was terrified. She pressed her face against the bus window, watching the nice cars go by. "They're going to hate me," she muttered. "I don't look like them." Mr. Baker sat next to her. "They don't care how you look, Chloe. They care what you sound like." They walked into the conservatory. It smelled like expensive wax and fresh flowers. A woman named Mrs. Higgins met them. She was the director of the school. She wore a stiff suit and looked very serious. She led them down a hallway to a large room with a massive concert grand piano in the center. It was the most beautiful piano Chloe had ever seen, black, shiny, and looking brand new. "So," Mrs. Higgins said, looking at a clipboard, "we heard about your performance. But we need to see if it was just luck." She pointed to the piano bench. "Play something, anything." Chloe froze. The room was too big. The piano was too fancy. Mrs. Higgins looked too scary. She looked at Mr. Baker. He didn't nod or smile. He just waited. Chloe walked slowly to the bench. She sat down. She felt small in this giant room. She thought about the kids at the community center. She thought about her old foster home. She thought about the silence. She lifted her hands. She closed her eyes. She blocked out Mrs. Higgins. She blocked out the fear. She played the same Chopin piece she had played at the showcase, but this time it was different. It wasn't angry anymore. It was confident. The notes rang out clear and pure. She wasn't fighting the piano. She was dancing with it. She played with a passion that filled the huge room, bouncing off the high ceilings and echoing back to her. When she finished, she opened her eyes. Mrs. Higgins wasn't looking at her clipboard. She was looking at Chloe, and her serious face had softened. There were tears in her eyes. Mrs. Higgins cleared her throat and stood up straight. "Okay," she said simply. "We have a spot for you. Full scholarship. Boarding included." It took a moment for the words to sink in. Boarding included? That meant she didn't have to go to a group home. She could live here, at the school. She didn't have to move away. "You mean I can stay?" Chloe whispered. "You can stay," Mrs. Higgins said. "And you can practice on that piano every day." The next Tuesday was not a sad day. The gray van from social services did not come. Instead, a small yellow taxi arrived to take Chloe and her 2 suitcases to her new home. There was a crowd at the community center to say goodbye. All the kids were there, even the ones who used to ignore her. They hugged her. They high-fived her. They treated her like a celebrity. Mr. Baker stood by the door. He looked tired but happy. He handed her a small bag. "It's some sheet music," he said. "And a metronome. Don't forget the basics." Chloe took the bag. She looked at the dusty room one last time. She looked at the corner where the old upright piano sat. It looked sad and empty without her. "Thank you, Mr. Baker," she said. Her voice was soft, but it was strong. "You did all the work, kid," he said, ruffling her hair. "I just held the door open." Chloe picked up her suitcases. She walked out into the sunlight. It was a beautiful day. She wasn't the foster kid anymore. She wasn't the quiet girl who nobody expected anything from. She was Chloe, a musician. She climbed into the taxi. As the car pulled away, she looked out the back window. She saw Mr. Baker waving, and she saw her friends running behind the car for a few steps, waving goodbye. She smiled. She tapped her fingers on her knee, playing a silent rhythm on her leg. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The conservatory would be hard. The classes would be tough. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the future. She had her music, and as long as she had that, she had a voice. She looked forward at the road ahead, ready to play the next song of her life.